We covered a lot of ground last week, and the opening of the book. So we're going to have to kind of keep running a little bit, make it all the way through 13 chapters and in the quarter that we've got. But we'll be finishing up that first section today. There we go. Last week we kind of finished up with this slide. I know it's busy. It's online if anybody wants to download them. The writer of Hebrews started out with a lot of statements right in the very first 4 verses about all of the attributes of Christ, and then proceeded to show his Jewish brothers that all of this should have been known. This was all from the Old Testament. It's what God had prophesied. He just expounded on the legitimacy of the Old Testament passages, then followed that up with this wonderful phrase that in these last days he's spoken to us by his Son. And so we wind up on that trajectory of moving towards, we've listened to what all of the Old Law has to say, and we're going to keep seeing a lot of Old Testament passages in the book of Hebrews, but aiming towards the Son and what he wants and what the place that he has taken. All right, before we start, let's have a word of prayer, please. Father, we are so thankful that we're able to come together this morning, this beautiful day. We pray, dear Father, that as we open this great book, that you would help us to understand the things that are written, that we might be able to see the message that was given to those great people in the first century, but also, Father, that we would see the message for us as it helps us to understand the glory and the greatness of your Son. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so when we get down to the last part of chapter 1, somebody asked me a question about that last verse 14. Are they not all ministering spirits sent to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? Talking about the angels there. And I just wanted to say that in this particular passage, he's not trying to do anything strange or obscure or different or whatever about angels. In the previous parts, just look at it in context. How has he been describing the relationship between the prophets and the angels and the Son, and in particular the angels and the Son? What has he said over and over again in the first part? Okay, so we're looking at he was made a little lower than the angels for a while, right? And then has a name much greater than them. So what is he really saying in this verse? All he's saying is, we can tell, what's the purpose of the angels? They serve God. Ministering spirits, all it means is that they serve God. That's really all he's trying to say. So we're going to see that as he continues on down into chapter 2 and 3, when he starts talking about Moses. He's going to talk about Moses as a servant. Has all kinds of ones that serve God. But the Son has a different place. And he's already mentioned that in the first chapter. What's the unique position that the Son holds? Right hand of God. What else? What does it mean to be at the right hand? He is the heir. Okay? And that's going to be a big difference that the Hebrew writer is going to spend time on. And he finishes off in verse 4. We kind of finished, we started into the rest of it, but I want to start in verse 5 tonight, or this morning. It says that Jesus, he did not subject to angels the world to come, concerning which we are speaking. But one has testified somewhere, saying, what is man that you remember him, or the son of man that you are concerned about him? You have made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, and have appointed him over the works of your hands. There he's quoting again from the Psalms. And when you think about this quote in Psalms 8, he speaks of 2 things there. And we talked a little bit about that last week. When he says, what is man that you remember him? What else could we put in there? What does he say? When we use a word in that context like that, man, what are we talking about? Mankind, okay? Humankind. It's all of us. But then he says, what's the next thing he says? And the Son of Man, that you consider him. Now, that's a singular there. So he's talking about both all of us and the Son. as he's going through these attributes of being made a little bit lower than the angels, of God paying attention to what we are there. And I think that's the great part about that psalm, is that everyone can see putting into it, but it does unite the Son with humankind, right? Both on the same plane, and that's going to be important as he goes on. But he says that you have put all things in subjection under his feet, for in subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subject to him. But now we do not yet see all things subjected to him. Now, when you think about that one and you say, how is it that we're not all subjected yet? He says he's going to subject everything, but he says we don't see it yet. What's not? What's that? Okay, we've got that.
1 Corinthians 15:25 says, "For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet."
Okay, so is he reigning now? Absolutely. But is everything perfect and exactly like it should be on this earth yet? No. So that's where there's still a second coming, right? There's still a judgment to come, and at that time, everything will be in subjection to him. We see in another place where it says, every knee shall bow, right? So has every knee bowed yet? Not yet, but he is assuring them it will. So we don't see it yet, but it's coming. But we do see him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Well, it was fitting for him, from whom all things and through whom are all things, and bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. For both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brothers. We'll stop there for a second. And I don't know about you, but every time I come across that verse, there's something just a little jarring there. Does that hit anybody else that way? He's going to perfect Christ. How does that even work? What does he mean there? We think of perfect as being what? Having no flaws, all of that. But there's another sense that perfect has, and especially here in this context, it's a completeness, right? And so, was it necessary for Jesus to come and live with us? Well, the author of Hebrews says it was necessary. Now, does that mean that he actually learned anything different? I mean, we're talking about God who is omniscient, so there's not a learning thing here. Was it all for his benefit, or whose benefit was it for mostly? It's us. We're the ones who benefit from that. And how does it say that we benefit? He came and he suffered, and he was perfected through suffering, made complete through suffering. Concept is, and we'll see as we read on down, but think of it this way. All of us have had different things in our lives and different times when we've had difficulties and problems and trouble. What's one way that you get help when you need it, when you've got trying circumstances? Who can help you best? What's that? Exactly. Someone else who has experienced it, gone through it, and come out the other side and can say, look, I know you're having trouble, but I went through this, and I can tell you that it's survivable, right? Does that help? Yes, it helps. It gives us the strength we need to move on. So, why then was Christ coming? For that same reason. There's nothing that we have encountered that he hasn't also. And that's what he's talking about. It was fitting for him to do this. He's saying, I will recount your name to starting verse 12. I will recount your name to my brothers in the midst of the assembly. I will sing your praise, and I will put my trust in him. And behold, I and the children whom God has given me. So let's look for just a second at Psalms 22, if you want to turn over there. That's a very interesting psalm. well known by most of us, but also by the recipients of the letter. And as he's quoting that, he's moving pretty far down in the psalm. What is the first part of that psalm? Anybody remember the first verse of it? My God, why have you forsaken me? Why is that so well known? That is what Jesus uttered on the cross, right? Now, do you think that when he's quoting this part that's down in the thing, do you think they wouldn't have immediately jumped back to the beginning to understand what that psalm was about? One of the things we have to understand about the way that the Hebrew writer is using all of these Old Testament verses is he's not just pulling them out of context. He's not just grabbing a phrase because it happens to say something close to what he wants to say. He is expecting them to understand the context. So if you look at Psalms 22, we're not going to read the whole thing, but I want you to take a look. The first cry there is someone who is calling for God, right? They're saying, why have you forsaken me? I'm crying out to you. Beginning in verse 6, it talks about, I'm a worm and not a man. And he's concerned about his lowly position, and yet he's trusted God from his birth. And then his request, don't be far from me. And when you think about verses 11 through 18 and compare those to the Gospels, you'll see so many parallels there of the things that he's saying here that happened to Jesus when he was on the cross. So that's one of the ways that people go, oh, we know what this psalm is talking about, right? And when Jesus said those words, my God, why have you forsaken me? You don't think that those who were standing there would have then, I don't know, if I'd have been there, it would have been interesting, because if you had that psalm memorized and you're looking going, wait, they're dividing my garments, he's on all of those things are happening. But the latter part of the psalm, sometimes we forget, because what does it say? It says, you didn't forsake me. You've been with me the whole time. I will surely recount your name to my brothers. Why would he do that? Because God has been with him. And I think that's a view of the psalm we don't always look at. And that's the view that the Hebrew writers is wanting to point out, is that yes, Jesus came and he suffered, but in that suffering, what was he able to do but to call us his brothers? A relationship that's established there. And so the Hebrew writer wants to point that out. He wants to make sure that they understand it. And he has not abhorred the afflictions of those. And it says that I will pay my vows, and all, just the whole context there is of thanksgiving to God as he closes that out. And so he's expecting him to look at that. So when he says, I will recount your name to my brothers in the midst of the assembly, I will sing your praise. Now, that's the Septuagint rendering of that, where if you look at your Old Testament, it'll probably just say, I will praise you. But that's the concept there, of praising God. But he doesn't finish with just that one. He says, but let's look at Isaiah also. And so when he goes over to Isaiah 8, and if you think about the prior context there, again, he's saying, I will wait for Jehovah, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will hope for him. Septuagint says, I will trust in him. Behold, I and the children whom Yahweh has given me are for signs and wonders in Israel's, from Yahweh of hosts who dwells on Mount Zion. And again, if you look at Isaiah 8, first part of it is clear reflection of their history and their time. But then it goes into a very messianic discussion of all of the things that they're expecting from God to do for them in Zion, in which they had expected this would only occur as part of the Messiah coming. So when he brings these messianic passages into these people, that's what he wants them to kind of grab a hold of. We still have to keep in mind, what was their greatest hope? What was it that had kept kind of the Jewish people in any kind of hope for hundreds and hundreds of years, but this looking for the promised future, right? And I can just see them wanting to, kick them Romans out of there. We'd like to get our country back. And the Hebrew writer saying, actually it happened, and you need to just look at it in a little different way. I will put my trust in him. Behold, I and the children whom God has given me. Therefore, since the children share in the flesh and blood, he might likewise also partake of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. Now, there's an interesting piece about that. It says that through his death, he conquered death. But how did he do that? By being raised. And he doesn't specifically state that here, does he? But that's implied. Because that's where Satan lost his power, right? Satan was saying, we got to kill this one, and then we'll all be over with. And then what happens? He rose on that glorious day. And so he's saying here, that was the main thing that he did for us, this death. He rendered powerless him who has the power of death. Who's that? That's Satan. So again, understand the context. Assuredly, he does not give help to angels, but he gives help to the seed of Abraham. Who's the seed of Abraham? It becomes all men, doesn't it? There's two contexts in which you can read it. Even Paul is the one who talks about that, where he goes, okay, there's the physical seed of Abraham, and yes, they had this advantage. But who becomes the seed of Abraham? The faithful. And that is going to be part of this transition as he moves into his next section, is starting this whole concept of the faithful. And he does that by beginning here with this mention of Abraham. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For since he himself was tempted in what he has suffered, he is able to come to help those who are tempted. So when you think about that last section, it gives us this interesting piece. Why was it necessary for Jesus to live as a man? So that he could become the high priest, so that he could offer aid. Now, why is he concentrating on this part? And we talked a little bit last week about the fact that Jesus wasn't the Messiah that they were hoping for, right? Remember any of the kind of problems? What were they really looking for in a Messiah? What's that? Okay, a physical leader. What else? Someone from the line of David, but with kind of the glory of David, right? They wanted that glory also. What else? How would you compare him with Moses as a lawgiver? Moses was a bit flashy in some respects. Now, it was God that was flashy there, right? But when you think about Mount Sinai and the whole giving of the law there, that was pretty spectacular. You think it didn't inspire some awe in the people that were there when there's a ring of Levites keeping them away from the mountain because they said, anybody touches this, they're going to die? And yet, in the end of Hebrews, we're going to see that you've come to Mount Zion, which is approachable. This is a different mountain we're going for. So how did this qualify him to be high priest? We're going to see a little bit more about it when he gets more into it, because this is the first time that he mentions in Hebrews about him being high priest. This is the first mention. He had kind of a hint of it, and part of his qualifications when he said that he made propitiation for sin. That was a priestly duty, but now he's introduced this new concept that he's become our high priest. What was the job of the high priest? What was that? Intercede for the people, right? That was his job. Offer the sacrifices for the people. That's what he had to do. My favorite picture of that was Aaron. He was the first one, right? Anybody remember the famous time when they had the plague? What did he have to do? Yeah, that phrase is pretty poignant when you think about it, because it says he took his stand between the living and the dead. That's a dangerous place to stand, right? Why? He's next in line. He's on that line. That was the high priest's job, was to stand between man and God. Now, there was one problem with the high priests, and we're going to see more about it here. But what was the main problem with the high priests? They're people, they have their own sins. They have their own problems, and they die. And there's a big difference between those high priests and the high priest Jesus. And what was that? Yeah, he rose again. He died, but he rose again to stay there forever. Tom?
I think there's an incredible picture in verses 14 and 15 to convince these Hebrew Christians who are falling away. And the picture is this: every man is afraid to die, in captivity of it, in plague of man because of his sin. We already found out he tasted death for every man, but in verses 14 and 15, there's this: that he might free those who fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives.
Yeah.
The late CNN radio host Larry King, he said this: I hate the thought of non-existence because I already have existence. He was petrified of it. And so was really everybody who will at least admit it.
Yeah, and our culture doesn't say that a whole lot sometimes, but isn't our whole culture afraid of dying? I mean, one of the things that we're doing is we take absolutely extraordinary efforts to extend life, right? And I think as Christians, that's one of the things, a little side note there, but I think as Christians, that's something we have to be careful of. I'm not saying we can't get medical attention. Obviously, I just had a shoulder replaced. But sometimes we're so busy trying to keep people alive that it's almost like we're trying to keep them out of heaven.
I've often thought about that, and I think it's kind of a paradox because I think God gives us the will to live.
Oh, absolutely.
He doesn't want us sitting around just waiting to go home.
Yeah.
Because we can't grasp what home is really like. We're afraid to let go of the will to live here.
But I have actually seen people who were ready, that they had enough faith that they're done, they're ready to go. That's kind of a goal. I think should be a goal.
Not to get too far off topic, but I got in this discussion with somebody along that same vein about a lot of times we have this striving to make the world a perfect place, right? And sometimes I think a lot of people get too focused on that and like, look, folks, the world's never going to be perfect. There's always going to be something wrong. So
Absolutely.
the idea is that we should do what we can while we're here, which is outlined in the scriptures, but we're busy.
Absolutely. And Hebrews 11 is where we're going to see more of that, right? But that concept, I think, is part of what he's introducing here when he talks about, as Tom brought up, this whole concept of we fear death. And Jesus should be taking that away. That's part of the glory, is getting rid of that fear.
I had somebody, and it's that fine line we have to walk, like we're taught to be content, but I heard somebody put an interesting spin on it. We shouldn't be content because this is not our home. We want to be content with the things that God's provided for us while we're here, but ultimately we don't want to get to the point where, because we're not where we're ultimately going to end up.
Right. And I think that is a message that he's wanting these people to see as well, is that it's not about what happens here. It's about what we can expect from God in the future. And that's where we need to have faith. And that's where we need to get a different view of a Messiah than potentially they had. Now, this slide's way busy. You can download it online. But I just thought this was interesting because this was his first mention here in chapter 2 of Jesus as high priest. And I had put the other graph on with the big spike there that showed how many times it's used. Well, this is every reference to Jesus as high priest there in Hebrews. And if you'll notice, it's in chapter 2, it's in chapter 3, it's in chapter 4, it's in chapter 5, it's in chapter 6, it's in chapter 7, and finally in chapter 8 he says, now the main point that I'm going for is this, after he's already mentioned it multiple times. And then he brings it up again in chapter 9, but it's not in 10, 11, or 12. But when we get there, you'll see that those chapters are all about, I've established this thing. How does this affect you personally? What are you supposed to be doing? So it's not like it's not there. It's not specifically mentioned. But notice he doesn't stop without bringing it back one more time as he closes out the book to go, we've got this high priest who brought his blood for us. So keep that in mind as we go through it. This, to me, is just, it's kind of this interesting theme that runs through. So if we look at this first section that kind of ends with chapter 1 and 2, he made a premise in the very beginning where he said, God spoke to us through his son. Now, this is something that people would have said, okay, we can handle that. And his proof was all these Old Testament passages, right? And he just kept quoting things over and over and over to show and to back up what he'd said before. But then there's a therefore. And chapter 2, let's not lose sight of what this therefore is, right? If all of that he stated is true, we need to pay attention. But then he finishes up with kind of this corollary. Jesus may not have been what you expected, but he was glorified in his death, not diminished in his death. And so that's kind of his first opening salvo. Let's get and understand who the Son is. Let's understand that it's through him that we're expecting our salvation, that he is going to take the place of both prophet, priest, and king. All three have been brought up in there. And now we get to the second kind of speech that he starts there in chapter 3. And he begins it with that word, therefore, again, which, of course, is going to be referencing all that he said before. But now he's going to talk about this promised rest. And that's kind of an interesting transition in many ways. He says, therefore, holy brothers, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Jesus. Let's just take a look at that one sentence just for a minute. Holy brothers, what does that do? What does that statement mean? What's that? Okay. Holy, set apart. We have to strive to be holy, but we can't do that on our own, can we? But he's calling the holy brothers. What is he doing there? He's establishing this relationship between the writers and the readers, right? That's a very important part of what he has to do, is make sure that he understands, or that the readers understand, he is with them on this, right? Next he says, they're partakers of a heavenly calling. Isn't this a reminder? We know that part of the difficulty these people are facing is the trials and tribulations, and they're tempted to just kind of fall away. They're not really tempted to go back to Judaism. I don't think that's the case here. They're just tempted that, like, life is getting hard. Maybe if I just quit this Christian life, it'd get easier, right? But that's a problem. But he's saying, you've got a heavenly calling. Do we have a heavenly calling? Absolutely. That kind of sheds a little different light on it in a way. Holy brothers who are partakers together in a heavenly calling. Consider, think about this one we've just been talking about, right? The apostle and high priest, second mention of that. But before he says high priest, he says apostle. What's an apostle? Someone who is sent out. Who's he an apostle of? God, right? And that's really the same thing he said in the very first verse when he said God has spoken to us through his Son. He's the prophet, he's the apostle, he's the one. So we've got this relationship of familiarity, this request between the writers and the readers. That some translations, instead of apostle, will have emissary or prophet or one sent from God. All of those are good synonyms there to understand what he's saying. And high priest. This isn't earthly or physical. This is heavenly. And our positions, both of these positions, apostle, high priest, keep in mind they're appointed positions, right? It's kind of fun, different thinking of Jesus as an apostle, right? Who do we think of when you hear the word apostle? Who do you think of? We got 12. Oh, wait, no, maybe 13, maybe 14. Only 12 at a time. But when you think about it, that's who you always do. But who were they in training under? The apostle, right? The one sent. So by pulling all of this in, he goes, you know what? We've got some obligations here. Consider this, Jesus, who was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was faithful in his house. For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, in so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which are spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope. Now, when you think about those, why does he bring Moses up at all? Why bring up Moses? He was the lawgiver. Was he respected by the Jews? Almost venerated by the Jews, right? To him was given the Torah, the law. And what does the Hebrew writer say about him? He was a faithful man. Now, did Moses have some difficulties? Yeah, but isn't it neat that you can say someone who has faults and whatnot, kind of like David, and say, this man was faithful to God. But in what role? We brought up this servant again, right? Faithful as a servant. What's the difference between a servant and a son? Servant's not the heir, right? Servant is not the heir. And he's saying Moses was faithful, but Jesus was faithful over the house as a son. Therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with this generation and said, they always go astray in their heart. They did not know my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Kind of an abrupt transition there, isn't it? But he's brought up Moses, and Moses is being faithful, but then he pulls this quote out, and when you think about what he says here, it's important to note that Moses is faithful, but these Old Testament scriptures, when you think about the people that were under Moses, what does it say about them? They had some troubles. They had some troubles. In fact, it says, do not do what? Harden your hearts. Don't harden your hearts like they did. Now, you think back on that ragtag band of people that came out of Egypt. And it was quite a motley crew when you think about it, right? They were slaves. Some Egyptians that came out with them. They'd been raised in a land that had nothing but idolatry. Brought out into the wilderness. And what was the first thing they started saying? You brought us out here to die.
Obviously, he's speaking to a lot of people that would have been familiar with this, and they didn't have the benefit of cliff notes like I specifically. But my references, Numbers 12 and 7, were basically God admonished Miriam and Aaron and said that Moses is faithful in all of my house. So hopefully that's something maybe they would have understood. So I'm reading it right now, and it said, hear now my words, is there a prophet among you? I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house.
Yeah, and they would have known that and expected that. And so I think that's the contrast that he's making. So Moses is faithful, but what about all these people that Moses is leading? What happened to all the ones that came out of Egypt? They died before they entered the promised land. He said, I was angry at them for 40 years. And of course, you have to get the right mental image of this. When I was a kid, we always hear the subtitle on the lesson would be The Wilderness Wanderings. And so my vision was, this 1.6 million or 2 million, or however how many it was, people all in a single file on a line kind of rotating through the desert. And every so often, somebody would just sort of fall over. And, that'd be it until they're all gone. I don't think it quite worked that way. But that's the kind of image that he's pulling here, right? Is that for 40 years I was angry with them. And what's the point that he's making? The point is at the very end of that verse there where he says, they shall not enter my rest. Why is he bringing rest up here? What is that going to resonate with?
With Christ's new covenant, with his Christ's house, he offers that rest.
Okay, so we're looking for a rest, and that rest with Christ is one of the goals that we have. Even at their time, in their persecution, what would they have been wanting? Release from that, some sort of respite from this persecution. And in a way, isn't that something, you ever had opportunities when you just had to go, I just have to sit down and rest for a while, right? Or I have to get away and I have to rest for a while. There's this built-in desire, need for us to rest. But he brings that in and he says, they'll not enter into my rest. So God's rest is going to be a little different than maybe what we think of as rest. Ramon.
As you say that, and going back a little bit, in chapter 3, that last portion of verse 1, you said that about the apostle and the high priest, but that last portion of our confession that links not just the fact that he's the apostle and high priest, but he's the one who you've been confessing. He is the one who's going to give you that.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that back up. So that is another link between them and Jesus, right? Is they're already believers. This isn't trying to reconvince them to believe in Jesus. It's trying to give them a reason to hang on. And so he says, you've been confessing this. Tom.
The power of verse 7, when he says, therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says, interesting using that language, because the Holy Spirit is given, he convicts the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment to come. The Holy Spirit is saying it's meant to convict them. You got to hear the voice of God. Don't harden your heart. This is meant to really get them out of their stupor.
Absolutely. And bringing this quote forward is interesting because that has been a problem of Jesus, of the people of God from the time that they came out of Egypt, right? I mean, over and over again, that was part of the difficulty that they had, was listening to the voice of God. And so that's another emphasis that he's putting in here. And so when you think about this, Jesus worthy of more glory than Moses, he's gotten that by going up beforehand. But then when he comes in with this, today if you hear his voice, that comes out of Psalms 95. Really that whole concept, that whole passage, I think there's two main things that he wants them to get. Obviously the whole thing is a message, but I want you to look at two main things. First of all, he starts with, don't harden your hearts, right? Lots of people have done this in the past. Don't harden your heart. Is it still relatively easy for people to harden their hearts today? That's just an ongoing problem. It is so easy to get caught up in any number of things in this world that begin to put a barrier between us and our God. And the only way that we're going to be able to kind of overcome that is to keep thinking about, keep your heart soft, keep looking at what God says. Because if you have a hard heart, what was the result? You will not enter my rest. So now he's put two things together that they need to pay attention to. And that is, listen to God or you won't achieve this rest. Part of that difficulty is they've already been through some temptations. They've already had some trials. They've persevered through some, but are now in more. And he's saying, you've already gone through part of this. Don't let your past successes become nothing. It's not like God weighs it all up and goes, well, let's see, for 60% of your life you did pretty well, and for the last 40%, not so good. Well, on balance, okay. No, that's not what he wants, is it? What he wants is you to keep trying and to keep working on it and not to harden your heart. The first mention of God's rest is in the book of Genesis. And we'll see that this concept, I think, is part of what the Hebrew writer has in mind as he wants these people to remember this. If you look over in Genesis 2, the seventh day, God completed his work, which he had done. He rested on the seventh day from all of his work, which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because on it he rested from all his work, which God had created in making it. Now, you look at that and you go, okay, God rested from all of his work. Was God tired? Clearly not. Okay. Did he stop doing everything? No. We still have passages that talks about God continuing to work. And so when you think about this, what was it that he rested from? Creation. And what does it mean by that? It was done. It was finished. It was complete. But this concept of I've finished this, I'm entering into my rest of I'm not having to do the creation part, but he talks about him upholding the world by his power, right? So God's still in charge of all of this. But when you think about that and this rest, it's not that God was tired. It's not that he ceased all activity. The idea seems to be that it was a time of harmony. Think about that whole point of rest. What was it that he finished with man, and where were they? Adam and Eve, where were they located? Garden of Eden. What do we think about as the Garden of Eden? What's another name people quite often say for it? Paradise, right? What's our concept of paradise? That's where you want to live, right? Unless it's like Paradise, Texas. Probably not. But you understand that concept? Paradise, of a place that you could look forward to, that this is a great place. Was it that for Adam and Eve when God finished his creation? And in fact, you see hints of that in Isaiah and in Ezekiel and in Revelation, that when he starts talking about even Revelation, that the tree of life is going to be back where? When God comes and renews all of this after his second coming, and after that is pulled together, it'll be like a reestablishment in a spiritual sense of the garden that was there in a physical sense. So in a way, the garden was sort of this type of God's rest. What he wants is this relationship with us. You want to enter into God's rest, what does that mean? That means being in the presence of God. How did Adam and Eve talk with God? It said they walked with him in the garden. So I think that's the concept that he's trying to get across, is that's God's rest. That's the real rest that we want, is reestablishing that relationship. But that rest is key to the Mosaic covenant. It was codified, right? I mean, that's where the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and then he's got a whole bunch of stuff. A lot of the commandments, they only get one line. A couple of them get more than one. This is one of them. And in fact, he says, 6 days you shall labor, do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of Yahweh your God. In it you shall do no work. And then he lists a whole bunch of people, neither you, nor your sons, nor your daughters, nor your slaves, nor, you get all these people that he lists. And he says, for in 6 days he made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Okay, he's just repeating what we saw in Genesis. Therefore, Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it what? Holy. Now, that was for them. It's not like we had that same restriction on us as part of our covenant. This was actually the sign of the Mosaic covenant. But the concept there was what? That there was time set aside for them to be close to God. And so that Sabbath observant of the Mosaic law was rooted in that whole creation concept, right? And so that's part of the echoes that he's bringing in here with God's rest, this Mosaic Sabbath rest. Did all activity completely cease on the Sabbath? No, and in fact, Jesus talks about even the priests on the Sabbath day are doing work, right? That's their job. But the purpose of the Sabbath day was it was dedicated to God. And I think that's part of what he's talking about in this rest as he's looking at is what is our relationship there? What is one of the things that we'll be privileged to do if we are able to enter into God's rest? To worship and to serve him, right? And give him glory. Other rests that are mentioned are all based on this harmony relationship. Sabbath year. Remember what that one was? Every seventh year, what'd they have to do? Yeah, not plow the fields. They could only eat whatever they gleaned or what happened to grow naturally. Now, turns out that things will just grow on their own, and places been planted. My dad had all kinds of what he called volunteers in his garden sometimes. But why do this? What was the whole point there? Who are they going to trust? They've got to trust God to do it. Then he says, and if that's not enough, probably at least once in their lifetime, they're going to come up against the Jubilee year, which is every seventh year. So that's 2 years in a row. And in this one, that's when there's a release of all the slaves, and that's when they, return all the property, and all the leases expire, and there's all kinds of stuff that happens in the Jubilee year. You're talking about faith and trust. Yeah, okay. But once again, that's part of that. Why is it? Trust me. I want you to trust. Deuteronomy 12th chapter, he will give you rest from all your enemies. One of the promises that he gave them as they were heading towards the new land. 2 Chronicles, I like this one. This is King Asa. He didn't have to fight many wars because it says God gave him rest on every side. So there's all kinds of instances where it says God's giving people rest. And yet, in Hebrews, what is he aiming at? He's aiming at them to understand this relationship concept, and he's saying, these people failed. They did not enter into God's rest. Why? They hardened their hearts. But when he continues it, which we're going to have to do next week, we'll be looking at the main word that he wants to come out here was unbelief. And now it's kind of figure out how you're going to wrap your heads around that, because these people clearly believed. How can they be accused of having unbelief? We'll start there next week.